Inflation's 4.2%. And since the target's 2%, that's a troubling number. The real number? It's worse. When you put that 4.2% on a chart going back to 2018, it doesn't necessarily look that alarming, since the inflation peak was 9% in mid-2022, and it's come a long way down since. 4.2% is kind of in the middle of the range, but that's misleading comfort, since the year-over-year number, by definition, doesn't really show any abrupt changes that might have just happened. So we prefer a different measure. We prefer the most recent monthly number, what prices did this month compared to the immediate prior month, annualized, to give you a sense of the current pace. And what that shows right now is a very different picture. Now just look at the blue bar in this chart, and it shows that using this method, the most recent 3 months reach above 7%, abruptly higher than all the months before them. That's the Iran war, of course, which is hammering gasoline prices. The headline says 4.2%, but our look shows that the rate is well above 7%. In fact, it's 10.1% if you average March, April, and May. So no wonder the Trump administration is so eager for a deal to end the war, and as you know, announced the deal that's supposed to be signed in Geneva this week. But wait, perhaps the spring months are always higher than other periods. Maybe this is just seasonality. So to be safe, we compared this unadjusted month-over-month rate for the last 3 months to the exact same period of 3 months in the prior year, and it confirms our fears. It's 10.1% in 2026 compared to only 3.9% in 2025. So for 3 straight years after 2022, inflation was getting better, and now that's undone, which raises the obvious question, what flipped? Let's look at these 2 lines. One is energy, one is everything but energy. Energy's alone is up almost 25% over the prior year. Gasoline alone is up 40%. Of course, this isn't much news to anyone who's filled up their tank in the last 3 months. Now, here's what's so striking about that. Energy's only about 6 or 7% of what the typical household spends, but it's running so hot that it's responsible for roughly a third of all the measured increase in inflation. Everything else, groceries, clothing, rent, services, is sitting at about 2.9% and has barely budged from that level in months. This isn't a broad inflation problem. The war in the Middle East is the problem, and it's set energy prices sharply higher. Which just brings us to the Fed, and here's where it gets a bit frustrating. The Fed steers monetary policy using something called core PCE, a broad measure of consumer spending without food and energy. In fact, it strips those 2 things out. Excuse me, they measure inflation without considering energy or food? This entire Iran war-based energy price surge, all these months of it, barely registers in the number the Fed takes most seriously. Their theory is that those prices jump around too much to be useful. But keep in mind, these are the guys that were telling us the world was in great shape just months before the global financial crisis in the summer of 2007. There's the crucial related problem. The White House wants lower rates and appointed a new Fed chair with that exact hope. However, with inflation running hot because of the Iran war, raising rates is back on the Fed's table. Common sense tells us that raising interest rates doesn't produce more oil, which is what we need at the moment. In fact, what higher rates often do is make inflation worse. They make borrowing more expensive, which eventually pushes housing costs higher, and just one aspect of how high rates feed back into the very inflation index everyone is trying to get down. The people getting squeezed the hardest by energy and food prices are exact same people who can least afford it and afford the high borrowing costs that come along. We've seen this before. The great inflation of the 1970s was fundamentally an oil story. OPEC cut supply. Prices surged by a factor of 10 times, from $4 to almost $40. But U.S. producers stopped drilling because President Nixon had imposed a price cap on domestic oil in the early 70s. Our brief 21-22 bout of inflation was similar. COVID froze supply chains. The Ukraine war sent energy prices through the roof, and inflation hit 9%. And then as COVID receded, the supply chain more or less healed or was restored on its own. So back to President Trump and this newly announced deal. Truth is, the sides are so far apart on the real issues, this stasis may be the best we can hope for. A ceasefire and negotiations that get extended and re-extended and then re-extended some more, if I were to guess, at least past November's midterm elections. After all, for those of you who pay attention to such things, the Korean War itself is still technically going on 73 years past its ceasefire agreement. Let's hope we do better than that this time. Let's keep our fingers crossed. That's it for this week.